Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar hosted by PYA. Today, we are continuing our timely, tough, or tricky physician compensation and fair market value topic series with a presentation on physician compensation benchmarks, tracking tricky terms and trends. PYA is happy to present today's webinar on this important topic. You will have the opportunity to submit questions to today's presenters by typing a message into the questions pane of the control panel. We'll collect these and address them via email after the webinar. And all of our webinars are recorded and released with a copy of the slides after the event. With that, I would like to introduce Lyle Oelrich, Principal, and Derek Long, Senior Manager at PYA.
Thank you, Trevor, and good morning to all of our participants today. My name is Lyle Oelrich, and I'd like to extend another warm welcome to each of you as we begin another timely, tough, or tricky, or perhaps what we call triple T webinar as a part of this 2023 series on physician compensation and fair market value. Today, we're going to be talking about a foundational topic as it relates to both fair market value and physician compensation, that of benchmark compensation and productivity surveys. So for many years, we've taken it upon ourselves to educate our clients about this subject because it is so important to make sure we understand how to use these surveys appropriately. And that begins by certainly understanding the definitions, the terms, the trends, and the impact of recent events, given that the data in these particular surveys typically fall 1 to 2 years behind the date of the survey. Again, many of you are probably aware, but a survey that comes out, for example, in 2023 is generally based on data from 2022. So before we begin, of course, let's just handle a couple of quick housekeeping items. First, just a quick reminder that what we talk about here today is sort of for general educational purposes only, and it's not intended to issue or provide any specific advice on a particular issue. Of course, unfortunately, given our limited time today, there's no way we're going to be able to cover all of the applicable surveys, terms, or trends that need to be discussed. So please forgive us if there's a specific item you might be dealing with that we didn't have time to cover today. But of course, we're always happy to talk with you about these particular scenarios. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And secondly, from a housekeeping perspective, we'll also be asking for your participation during our discussion today by just quickly answering a couple of multiple choice questions. So don't worry, no one's going to have to come off of mute to participate in our presentation today, but we would like to, and I think you would agree that you benefit from some of the data that we're going to share here today. So to talk about this subject with me today, I'm pleased to be joined by my colleague, Derek Long. Derek is a senior manager in our compensation valuation and planning and design department, what we refer to as our CVPD team. He's located in our Kansas office, has over 20 years of experience, and works on numerous compensation valuation, commercial reasonableness, business and machinery equipment valuations, among other types of projects. Again, for myself, I am a principal in PYA's CVPD department, located in our Knoxville office, have over 25 years of experience working on a variety of sort of financial or operational strategic issues, certainly including compensation valuation, but also things like physician practice, operational assessments, and the like. So as we start here today, as we've done in prior webinars, I just wanted to remind everybody of a survey that we took that we used to organize this particular webinar. We took this survey in the beginning of January of this year, and so we've been using this sort of as an outline for the series. We have previously spoken on many of these topics, such as advanced practice providers, the end of the public health emergency, the 2023 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, unique call coverage scenarios, and then anesthesia and other hospital-based specialties. And of course, today we're going to be talking about benchmark data. This is, and we're fortunate that this is sort of the second season of the Triple T webinar series. There is an entire 2022 series as well. We get comments periodically that having that access to that information is really helpful. So that webinar series is out there. Those are also 30-minute webinars. I'll ask the moderator to chat in a link to that particular series here, so that you have all of these that are available from both 2022 and 2023. So let's jump right in and begin talking about some of the glossary nuances. So over the next few minutes, we're going to be discussing how various industry benchmark surveys define three commonly used metrics within these surveys. And I wish we had more time to do more, but we're going to be talking about total compensation, benefits, and work RVUs. And of course, we recognize that there are certainly other surveys besides AMGA, MGMA, and Sullivan-Cotter. We're going to be using those for demonstration purposes today. But we wanted to focus on these three fairly commonly used surveys because I think some of the trends and the definitions and the issues that we're going to talk about are represented within these surveys, certainly others as well. But wanted to begin by talking about total compensation. So on the screen here, you'll see how each named survey specifically defines total compensation. And the definitions here are really important. I'm not going to read them to you all, but I do think it's important to pause and talk about what is included in total compensation, because it includes a multitude of items. So generally speaking, total compensation includes salary, any productivity-based compensation, bonuses such as retention, sign-on bonuses, and the like, administrative stipends, medical directorships, research, teaching, call coverage, APB supervision stipends, honoraria, profit distributions, moonlighting stipends, and other compensations such as clinical quality or patient satisfaction are also almost always included in the definition of total compensation. But ultimately, as you can see here, it ends up being the amount of compensation that's on a physician's W-2 or the equivalent documentation such as a 1099 or a K-1. But equally important to knowing what's included perhaps is what is actually excluded from total compensation. So perhaps not to your surprise, and we're going to talk about this a little bit further here in a moment, fringe benefits is not included. Expense reimbursements are not included as well. Sometimes we see a little bit of confusion related to those couple of items, and I'm going to share an example here in a moment that might be a little bit confusing related to the topic as well. But I will say one more thing about this slide before we move on. Sullivan-Cotter, interestingly enough, does not include call pay within their total compensation. So that might be a little bit of a variance and something to be aware of if you use Sullivan-Cotter and you're comparing and contrasting between these two particular surveys. So now let's talk a little bit about benefits. Again, you'll see the definition according to each survey here on the screen. But what I'd like to talk about here for a moment is some of the common mistakes that we see when individuals calculate physician benefits. So first, actually at times we see organizations really not make a comparison to the benefits at all. They're just kind of comparing the total proposed compensation to the total compensation in the surveys, and they forget about making comparisons to the benefits. And I want to encourage you just to think for a moment why it might be important to consider and compare the benefits if you don't do that. First, of course, not all benefit packages are created equal, and physicians will want to understand the differences associated with each of them. And there are differences, and sometimes they can be material differences. But also an important sort of to note from a compliance perspective, you know, compensation and benefits make up total remuneration. And that's a key term that the federal anti-kickback statute, as well as other regulations, refer to from time to time when they're thinking about what's being transferred of value to potentially induce business that's reimbursable by federal healthcare programs. So it certainly can include benefits as well. Now, if someone is making a comparison to the benefits, some of the more common mistakes that we see is, first of all, not including the employer portion of payroll taxes in the calculation of benefits. That's probably the number one mistake we see. Then not including professional development costs and not including dues and memberships in the professional organizations as well. I mentioned before I wanted to share a quick example where I think this can get a little bit confusing as we think about what's compensation and what may be benefits. So let's walk through that here for just a moment. I was actually asked last week whether a 457F plan, which is essentially deferred compensation, should be counted towards total compensation. That was the question that a client asked us. And you can see in this slide here under MGMA that quote unquote deferred compensation paid or expensed during the year should be counted as a benefit, at least for MGMA. I think it's pretty plain to see that here on the slide. But when the individual, in this case a physician, has a binding right to the deferred comp and is no longer subject to substantial risk of forfeiture, it would be included on a physician's W-2 and would be counted towards compensation. And so you can see here, it's not always clear cut whether in this example that should be counted as compensation or a benefit. And you've got to imagine with nuances like this, some folks may misapply an item like this. However, again, in this case, if you're making comparisons to compensation and benefits in the aggregate, sort of the potential misclassification in this instance can be mitigated. So that's another reason here to consider both comp and benefits. One more term that I wanted to talk about is that of work RVUs. And you'll see again here the definition according to the 3 surveys that's provided for work RVUs. And I wanted to get into just a few common themes that I think it's important to note on this particular item. So first of all, work RVUs should be modifier adjusted. So for example, modifier 81, which identifies or helps identify an assistant surgeon, will reduce that assistant surgeon's work RVUs as compared to the primary surgeon. So without that modifier, then a physician may be assigned too many work RVUs if they are serving, in fact, as the assistant surgeon. Second, I wanted to mention just a few comments about what's different in the work RVU definitions amongst the different surveys, and this one to me is really important. So each survey actually can be using a different year of the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule to report work RVUs. So here as an example, and this is citing, I think, the 2022 AMGA definition, AMGA tells you specifically what year of the CMS schedule to use. But we've seen other surveys tell you simply to use any available Medicare Physician Fee Schedule. And so that's really important because I think most of this audiences know there can be some substantial differences on work RVU values and the impact to certain specialties, depending on whether you're using the 2021, 2022, or 2023 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, or perhaps 2020. And in fact, just as a quick side note, and perhaps a little bit in support of what I just said, in one of our most recent Triple T webinars, we actually asked respondents what year of the Medicare Physician Fee Schedule they were using to submit physician work RVUs. And what they said is most organizations were actually still in the 2020 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, followed next by the 2023 Medicare Physician Fee Schedule, with the 2021 being the fewest. But it wasn't a really large direction one way or the other. It was almost split down the middle. So with those types of work RVUs being input in here, it's really important to understand what's in this benchmark data so you can then in turn around and make sure you're using the data appropriately as well. So finally, as it relates to our first poll today, I wanted to go ahead and ask the moderator to launch the poll. Which industry survey or surveys does your organization rely upon when assessing physician compensation and productivity? Is it MGMA, Sullivan-Cotter, AMGA, perhaps another survey, or even a combination of many of the different surveys? I'll give you all maybe 30 seconds to respond to that, and then I'll ask the moderator to pull up the results. I will say this, while we await the results, I think we still see a number of organizations relying on MGMA, perhaps as the primary survey, depending on what they're using the data for. If we're using it from fair market value, they may go in one direction. If they're using it for perhaps some unique scenarios where MGMA may have a more comprehensive data set, they may be relying more heavily upon that. But I do think, though, if you're using it for fair market value purposes, it's important to recognize a couple of guidance points that we know come from the Stark regulations. And I can do this almost by memory, but it talks about the reliance on multiple independently published surveys remaining a prudent practice for determining fair market value. So I think that's important to remember for our audience here today. So moderator, if you'll go ahead and release the results. So there you go. Interestingly enough, and I didn't know that, there's no way for me to know the results here, both MGMA and a combination of all the above. And I think that's probably right in line with what we see. So thank you all for participating in that poll. I will go ahead and turn the presentation over to Derek, who will begin to talk about trends in various specialties and metrics amongst the benchmark data.
All right, thank you, Lyle. So in this section of the webinar, we're going to discuss trends in 3 commonly used benchmark metrics used by both hospitals and evaluators alike, and that's total compensation, work RVUs, and compensation per work RVU. So jumping right in, here you can see how various specialties have trended at the median in terms of total compensation from 2018 through 2022. And we've averaged the medians as reported in the three surveys that Lyle just mentioned, some of the definitions from AMGA, MGMA, and Sullivan-Cotter. And as you can see here, we've chosen the specialties of internal medicine, pediatrics, hospitalist, non-invasive cardiology, orthopedic surgery, and urology, since these specialties, represent primary care, hospital-based services, and procedural services as well. And they also happen to represent some of the more prevalent specialties that we're asked to work on with respect to our compensation valuation services. So this graph shows that the median data has seen a steady increase in most all of these specialties, as evidenced by the compound annual growth rates that you see there in parentheses after the specialty names. And this compound annual growth rate, it measures the average annual growth over the time period seen, rather than just a straight growth calculation from 2018 to 2022. We see a slight dip in compensation in some of the 2021 survey data, which again is based on 2020 for a few of the specialties listed here, such as internal medicine, orthopedic surgery, and non-invasive cardiology. And really what happened in 2020, I think we all know it was COVID. So while organizations tried to keep compensation about the same for their physicians during 2020, they all just weren't able to get there and do that. So there's a little bit of a dip in 2020 compensation that shows up in the 2021 surveys. This steady increase across the board, it's not that surprising, because employed providers were generally protected by their employers, like I said, in trying to keep compensation levels pretty consistent. And independent providers, they were able to receive government funds such as the PPP to help supplement any lost income there. One interesting exception to this trend that I wanted to mention that you don't see on this graph is anesthesia. If we plotted anesthesia, and we didn't because subsequent slides on work RVUs and compensation per work RVU, those just aren't metrics that are utilized in anesthesia. But if we did plot it here, anesthesia's trend line would show an increase from 2018 to 2020, but then a decrease in 2021 and kind of relatively flat in 2022, with its compound annual growth rate for this time period being only 0.7%. And that's because as the need for and the reliance upon CRNAs became more prevalent since the COVID outbreak, the allocation of compensation within the specialty of anesthesia seems to be shifting towards CRNAs from the anesthesiologist, with the CRNA compensations actually increased at over a 3% compound annual growth rate since 2018, and 13% overall if you just take 2018 to 2022 there for CRNAs. And that's compared to just 3% overall for anesthesiologists. So based on our experience and observations, a lot of anesthesiologists' compensation has declined as they have had to pay the increasing CRNA costs with, at times the same amount of financial assistance from their, respective hospital or health system. And this is just something that we're seeing across the country as we work on valuations for anesthesia arrangements that we wanted to mention. So here, when we look at work RVUs kind of trended in the same way, we see a pretty substantial dip in that 2021 survey data, which is based on 2020 for all the specialties here. It's pretty obvious, and I think it's obvious that that's due to the effects of COVID again, because people, they just weren't getting out to go to medical facilities, and plus elective procedures were shut down in many places. And as you can probably guess, this affected pretty much every specialty across the board, which is evidenced based on what you're seeing here. However, we see significant increases from 2021 to the 2022 surveys, which is based on 2021 data, partly because pretty much everyone started to rebound from that initial COVID outbreak and its effects there. But something else significant occurred in 2021, which shows up in the 2022 survey data, and that is, as Lyle previously mentioned, that CMS increased the work RVU weights for certain CPT codes and procedures, mainly office-based E&M codes in 2021, and some of those were increased rather significantly. This was a change and something that was difficult for organizations, quite frankly, to analyze and administer, since a lot of organizations compensate their providers on a per work RVU basis. Many of them were, however, able to do their internal analysis and did in fact transition to the 2021 weights in 2021. While we don't know exactly how many organizations made that transition and reported these modified work RVUs to the surveys, we know that many did so, and the effects of that show up in the 2022 surveys for work RVU production across the board, because all but the specialty of hospitalist, had at least 14% increases from 2021 to 2022. The compound annual growth rates here still aren't very high, though, as the 2022 survey data is still reflecting that that rebound from COVID in 2020. Another tidbit I wanted to mention here is that if we look into the 2023 surveys, we can see that they are reflective of continued rebound from COVID, as well as potentially more organizations transitioning to more current work RVU schedules that have those increased work RVUs for office-based E&Ms. I looked at MGMA in particular for 2023, and partly because we just don't have 2023's AMGA or Sullivan-Cotter yet, but some examples from the percent increase change from 22 to 23 for MGMA, internal medicine, about 6% increase, pediatrics, about a 13% increase, and cardiology, non-invasive cardiology, had about a 7% increase. So a little bit of a indication of where things might be headed once all the 23 survey data comes out there. All right, on this slide, I find this slide very interesting, since it shows a pretty significant peak in compensation per work RVU medians in 2021, again, based on data from 2020 for all the specialties. And again, it's becoming a common theme. This is related to COVID. We have seen the decrease in work RVUs for all the specialties during that same year that we just looked at, while compensation was pretty much kept consistent, which caused a higher compensation per work RVU amount here. Then 2022 right-sized itself back to pre-COVID levels since work RVU production picked back up with some help from the CMS increases to the office-based E&M work RVUs. So what are the takeaways from all this data you're seeing here? Obviously, there's a lot of noise within the data for this metric, and because of this, organizations should be diligent about understanding these trends and the composition of the data if and when you're relying on this type of benchmark information. In looking at the compensation per work RVU survey data, this metric, it often has an inverse relationship, meaning the highest earners in compensation usually are among the lowest when it comes to compensation per work RVU. And what happens is this: the surveys, they identify the providers where they get both compensation and work RVU data, and they calculate those individual providers' effective comp per work RVU rates. And those effective rates are essentially what comprise the data set in those surveys. So it's generally best to rely on the median as a point of, and I'm putting this in quotation marks even though you can't see me, as a point of normalcy for a specialty. The upper quartiles that you see in the surveys for compensation per work RVU are typically providers that are paid a guaranteed or base salary but are low producers, which yields a higher effective compensation per work RVU. So some of these providers might be new recruits or new hires from out of the area, or providers that serve a specific clinical need in a low population area. The lower quartiles of compensation per work RVU could represent highly productive providers where compensation doesn't necessarily align with work RVU production. So this is going to yield a lower effective compensation per work RVU rate. So these providers could include highly productive physicians that are paid on a guaranteed salary, or those that have compensation per work RVU production incentives in their compensation plan that are around the median of survey data, for example. So I think we have another poll question here. All right, so when you recently reported data to the physician compensation surveys, what year of the physician fee schedule did you use in your submission? 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, or some other year not shown here? And we'll give you about 30 seconds or so to submit your responses here. As we mentioned, we've seen organizations, some perhaps that are still using 2020 given the significant changes that occurred in 21. Some made the transition in real time, some delayed it a year or two. So interested to see the results of this poll. I think that should be plenty of time. Okay, so it looks like, well, we've got a variety of responses here, but it looks like the majority of the responses seem to have organizations relying upon a year delay or so in terms of what is reported there. So thank you for participating in that. Okay, to wrap up here, the impact of recent, current, and future events on survey data. So there are a few prevailing trends here. I'm not going to harp on COVID too much because we talked about that plenty, but it's pretty plain to see from our previous section the impact that it's had on survey data, and that it truly does make things tough and tricky. In reality, the survey data followed pretty much everything else in our lives and changed significantly. So given the 1 year delay that Lyle mentioned in the data that's reported by the surveys, the data is really just starting to normalize in terms of the 2023 surveys related to COVID. The other significant impact to survey data that we briefly touched on are various changes to work RVU values implemented by CMS. So I mentioned 2021 brought increases to the office-based E&M codes, and 2023 this year brought increases to hospital-based E&M codes. So as an example that I wanted to provide, two of the most commonly billed E&M codes in each of those categories are 99213 and 99233. So 99213, the office-based E&M, increased from a work RVU value of 0.97 in 2020 to 1.3 in 2021, which is a 34% increase. And 99233 increased from 2.0 work RVUs in 2022 to 2.4 this year in 23, which is a 20% increase. So you can see how providers' work RVU totals can really increase almost, at the snap of a finger based on the composition of their utilization. So again, how did organizations deal with these changes? How do they continue to deal with them? Well, due to the number of physician contracts organizations have, like I said, many elected to delay transition in 2021 to a later year, maybe the next year, maybe 2 years down the road, which allowed them time to better assess, potential impacts of those changes to compensation, since many or perhaps all of their physician compensation arrangements contain terms that set compensation based on work RVUs. The same delay, I would think can likely be anticipated related to the 2023 changes to work RVUs. But simply transitioning and allowing much higher work RVUs would have led to significant compensation increases, potentially for organizations without, in many instances, corresponding collections to offset those increases in compensation. And to wrap up here, just wanted to mention in 2024, we've got more work RVU changes on the horizon with the implementation of the G2211 add-on code. CMS believes this code will be used by primary care and other specialties who treat, single serious conditions or complex conditions with consistency over a long period of time. CMS has assigned a work RVU value of 0.33 to this code, and an analysis predicts that the code will be initially utilized for 38% of all outpatient E&M codes and 54% after full adoption. So if providers utilize the code as projected, providers who are paid on work RVU based models could see an increase in compensation due to this, which is something else for organizations to consider if they're going to adopt the 2024 work RVU changes real time in 2024. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and turn it back over to our moderator. Thank you all.
Thanks to our presenters, Lyle Oelrich and Derek Long. If you have any questions, their presentation and contact information will be emailed to you, along with a recording of today's webinar. Also, if PYA can provide assistance with audit, tax, compliance, valuation, or physician services, call or email us. You may also visit our website at pyapc.com for more details about our specific areas of expertise or to subscribe to receive PYA insights. On behalf of PYA, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.